So let's move on to the first plenary lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce this plenary lecture of Dr. Michael Haugh of this workshop entitled The Metapragmatics of Teasing. Dr. Haugh is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Queensland in Australia and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. His research interests lie in the field of pragmatics with a focus to date on analyzing face, politeness and unpoliteness, indirectness, intention, and teasing and humor. In fact, his talk is devoted to the metapragmatics of teasing. He works with recording and transcription of spoken interactions, and he is also interested in the ways in which pragmatic phenomena have their distinct local flowers, both across and within languages and cultures. He has published more than 100 papers and books, including Unpoliteness in Implicature in 2015, Pragmatics in the English Language in 2014, and the Cambridge Handbook of Sociopragmatics in 2020 with Marina Terkurafi and Daniel Kadar. I would like to thank you for, I would like to thank you, your participation in this workshop. Thank you so much for joining this event. And you have now the floor. We are willing to enjoy your talk. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome. It's really an honor and pleasure to be joining this workshop on advanced studies on humor and gender. I won't be able to say so much useful to you about gender, I'm afraid, but I'll try and bring something to the conversation about humor, and particularly in this talk, I want to start addressing something that's, I guess, bothered me about humor studies for a long time, which is how we deal with not only the problem of translating humor, but kind of a meta problem. The meta problem of how we talk about humor, how we label it. Here, of course, I'm speaking in English and I'm using English terms, but I'm quite well aware when studying forms of humor in other languages, these terms in English don't necessarily work so well. So this is something I'd like to get into today. So rather than trying to talk about humor generally, which is such, even conversational humor is such a big topic, I thought today I could just focus on what comes under the banner of teasing. And just to be clear, I'm interested in the bit of teasing which has a connection with humor. So jocular teasing or joking teasing. Of course, teasing can be a form of bullying. Our children do this a lot with each other. Brothers and sisters like teasing each other. Maybe it's humor, maybe it's not. I'm really interested in the kind of humorous end of teasing. So I'm calling it jocular teasing here. So one of the first things to notice about teasing, and this is from a really interesting kind of overview study by a bunch of social psychologists, where they talked about teasing being a heterogeneous category. So teasing isn't just one thing. There's many different forms. It has multiple outcomes. What kind of characterizes teasing is it's sort of a combination of provoking, but also playfulness or something like this. So it's a combination of serious and non-serious at the same time. And of course, if it's a heterogeneous category of behavior, well, how many categories of behavior are here? And will these things work in the same way across different languages and cultures? So I'll just start with some definitions. I put in brackets in English because these are definitions taken from English dictionaries. There's no reason to think these would apply across all the different languages. But when you look at the word tease in an English dictionary, you get something like laughing at criticizing in a way that's sort of friendly and playful, or cruel and unkind. So there's sort of two ends of teasing. you're sort of ridiculing someone, you're mocking them, but there's an element of perhaps being friendly or playful. And of course, as I said, there's the cruel, unkind type of teasing, which is perhaps more like bullying. And in Paul Drew's study, he defined teasing as mocking but playful jibes against someone. So he was positioning it at that sort of friendly end. What's a jibe, which could be spelled in two ways in English? Some kind of insulting or critical remark that's meant to hurt someone or make them appear foolish. So when you look at these dictionaries, definitions of teasing, it doesn't really seem like a very nice thing to be doing. But it's something that people do a lot of across different cultures. In Australia, in Australian kind of mainstream culture, it's very frequent, actually. This kind of teasing is anything from within families, amongst friends, through to workplaces and meetings, and even with people you don't know. I've got plenty of examples where people tease people they don't know, they haven't met before. So it's a really common behavior. And I guess, why is it so common? Well, it's that combination of playfulness together with insulting or criticizing that we seem to quite enjoy. So when you start trying to look into the academic or scientific literature on teasing, what's remarkable to me when I looked across a range of different definitions of teasing were just how many different terms are used. But what's interesting is they sort of fall into the kind of a serious side and the non-serious side. And it's always a combination of these things. So it's annoying but artful. It's harassing but playful. It's irritating but mischievous. It's painful but it's sportive, and so on. And I tried to gather these terms up into some kind of typology, but it doesn't really work. But what you see is on one side, we can have things like it's joking and jocular and humorous. It can be playful, mischievous. It can be affectionate, fictional and sincere. Well, I think what's interesting about this is it's mixing up different things, different characteristics of teasing. It's mixing up the sort of affective, emotional side of it. So, things like affectionate and friendly and the relational part of it. It's adding in the kind of non-serious joking element, but also the element of play as well. And then all the things it might be doing is insulting and denigrating, being hostile, confronting, goading, provoking. There's a lot going on in teasing. And this is just the academic literature in English, of course, that I was looking at. It would be interesting to do a study of the terms that are used in scientific literatures in other languages, including Spanish, of course. I'm not sure how all these terms are translated and used. One thing that's become clear is this idea that some kind of continuum on which you put teasers. So Carolyn Strahl put it on a continuum from a kind of playful nip through to hostile bite. Diana Boxer and Cortés Conde, they had three: bonding, nipping, and biting. So biting, of course, is the more aggressive, hostile end. Bonding is kind of affectionate stuff, and nipping is a bit in the middle. I guess taking up some of the work that's been done by Bateson on play, of course. Social psychologists tend to distinguish between pro-social and anti-social teasing. So antisocial being hostile, pro-social being friendly. And I guess in more recent work with Melody Chang, we've tried to tease apart the sort of emotional, affective dimension of teasing, which is being affectionate or attacking, versus the sort of relational aspect of it, sort of showing intimacy or just some kind of passing relationship. Another work I've been doing, I've been very keen on trying to say that teasing involves a bunch of different sorts of practices. And these, I've used different terms like jocular mockery, jocular pretence, jocular baiting to try to distinguish between these different things. So just to give a sense of it, jocular mockery, the way in which I'm trying to distinguish these things is basically on the sort of sequential pattern that's evolved. What characterizes jocular mockery is it's very much a three-turn type of sequence. You start with some kind of teasable the thing that's occasioning the tease. So whether it's someone's dress, something they've said, something they've done, there's some kind of teasable, something which can be teased. Then you have the actual tease itself, followed in third position by some kind of affiliation or disaffiliation. So laughing acceptance, laughing rejection, maybe no laughing, just straight rejection, and so on. So that's kind of a three-turn structure. And this is where it involves some kind of diminishing of the target. So I've got an example here, just to briefly go through it. These two, they're both Australians. They've met for the first time. This is about 15 minutes into their conversation. And we'll just call her Penelope on this side. She's talking about at her wedding, for her bridesmaid, she ended up actually having a male bridesmaid. And so they were basically joking about this idea of a male bridesman and the best man and so on. And so they start joking. I'll try and play the clip and see if you can hear it. It's a little bit soft.
Yeah. I was best man at Nathaniel's wedding.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's a little bit strange, I know, but yeah.
Best person.
Yeah. Who said it? Who was that?
You were the best man he could find. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, hey, look.
Yeah. So essentially, sorry, it wasn't Penelope's wedding, it was a friend's wedding. So she went along and she ended up being the best, it wasn't the bridesmaid, sorry, it was being the best man. But of course we know Penelope's a female here. So they're basically teasing about the fact that she went along as a female best man. So as you can see, the teasable, I don't have it in the transcript, but she's basically explaining how she went along as the best man. Then we have the tease. It starts the best person, and then it's the best man he could find. So a play on gender here. And then there's this laughing appreciation. And actually in the video, you would have noticed she leans back and claps. So clearly some kind of affiliation here. And of course, they don't know each other, right? So it's a little bit of a risky thing to be teasing someone like this that you don't know. But in this case, it seems to be working quite successfully and she's appreciating the tease. The second kind of practice, which I've been talking about, is what I call jocular pretence. In this case here, the tease is designed not to occasion some kind of laughter straight away, but actually to occasion a serious response from the recipient, then to say, no, I'm just kidding, and then they laugh at that. So it's actually not a 3-turn sequence, but a 5-turn sequence. So this example here, again, these are two, they happen to be Americans who are meeting for the first time. This is very early in the conversation, actually. In fact, it's right at the beginning of the conversation. So this, again, is evidence that, you know, teasing is a way of starting to create intimacy with people you don't know.
He seems like he's up to something.
Yeah.
So you're American?
Yeah.
Oh.
That was the requirement for this, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just pretending to be American. No, I'm just
you're
kidding.
Doing a great job.
Thanks.
Okay, so in this particular one, so here she starts out the conversation with, so you're American. This is relevant because they thought they were going to meet some Australians. So that's why she's checking this. And he goes, yeah, that was the requirement for this ride. And then she comes in with this, I'm just pretending to be American. Now this is a bit obviously hard for Ian to process because you can hear her accent. She clearly sounds like an American. And so he actually starts responding seriously. Oh, you're, you know, some kind of perhaps a repair sequence, trying to understand what it is she's saying here. As he's saying that with a serious response, she's coming in with a no, I'm just kidding. And then you get the laughter. So the tease is designed to get a serious response from the person. Then you reveal you're just kidding, it wasn't serious, and then you get the laughter after that. So it has a different sort of structure compared to the jocular mockery that I was talking about. And then the final teasing practice, which I've been looking at, is something like jocular baiting. And here the aim is to try to get a counter tease out of the person. So the tease is designed to get laughter, and then a counter tease, which then can be responded to in turn. So that again is the tease is designed to do different things. So in the first one, jocular mockery, it's designed to get laughter. In the second, jocular pretense, it's designed to get a serious response and then reveal it's a pretense and then get laughter. In this one here, it's designed to get laughter and then a counter tease back. And of course, once you get a counter tease, this can be going back and forth ad infinitum, which is why I've got the plus n here. So this one here, I won't go through the whole transcript, but this is a discussion between Jill and Jeff. They're talking on the phone. It's from TalkBank, call friend, this piece of data, or the Santa Barbara corpus. And Jill and Jeff, from this conversation, we know that they're girlfriend and boyfriend. And Jill is relating about how she had a pregnancy scare. So she's relating to Jeff what's been going on here. And this, although it's obviously a serious topic of discussion, actually becomes treated as a teasable. So her getting so worried, it turned out to be a kind of a false alarm. She isn't pregnant, but she's relating to her boyfriend how concerned she was about it. Okay, I'll just play the clip, the relevant bit, because the way they talk with each other at this point is sort of quite important.
Are you sure it would have been mine? You know I would have denied it if you said it was mine.
I was messing around with the repairman.
Okay, so the tease that comes in here is, are you sure it would have been mine? So of course on the you know, when you hear that, the boyfriend asking his girlfriend, you know, if you've been pregnant, are you sure it would have been my baby? That's pretty insulting, right? However, it's clearly understood by Jill as at least designed to be heard as humorous. So she responds with laughter, and then he sort of continues to tease. You know, I would have denied it if you said it was mine. So he's teasing her that if you had been pregnant, I would have pretended I wasn't the father. This gets more laughter. And of course, at this point, this is when you get this counter tease coming in with this, I was messing around with a repairman. So starting to perhaps move into some kind of joint fantasizing sequence as well, where they're laughing here. So here, Jeff is not so much mocking Jill. He's not so much pretending. She knows this isn't true. He appears to be trying to bait her. He's trying to get a response out of her, some kind of rise. But of course, the rise is it's not meant to be a serious, angry rise. It's meant to be a humorous rise back. Okay, so when we're looking at these jocular teases, there's various ways in which people can respond. Of course, they can just disattend the tease. There's no response at all. They can reject it outright, a kind of po-faced response that Paul Drew talked about. People can go along with the tease, they can elaborate it, and they can counter tease. And the last two, of course, is what creates banter, and also, I think, nicely connects in with the work others have been doing on sustained humour sequences, of course, which is a really interesting area. Okay, so I just wanted to give a bit of background on the sort of teasing practices which I've been looking at. One of the things which has bothered me about this work is that all the examples, of course, I've shown you are in English. I've been working on other language data, but it's not that simple to operationalize these kind of practices in other languages. It's an open question whether we find jocular mockery, jocular pretense, jocular baiting in other languages. I think we do find instances of it, but are these the only practices which we can find? I'm pretty sure not. And I'll give you two examples of practices which we find in other languages, but are not so prevalent or not so recognized in English, at least as far as I've found. So one of the ones which I've been working on recently is a kind of teasing where it involves jocular flattery. And actually, the tease comes through an exaggerated positive evaluation. What's interesting about all those other ones is there's some kind of underlying insult or criticism buried in all the examples of teasing I looked at. in this particular teasing practice, it was really interesting to me because it was positive evaluation. And these examples were found in, I was working with some colleagues in China, and they're working with teasing that's happening in WeChat interactions, which is essentially very similar to WhatsApp and other kinds of messenger services. And what's interesting about jocular flattery in Chinese, the term is Feng Cheng Xing Jiakan. What's interesting about flattery in Chinese is it has very positive connotations. It can have negative connotations. You can do sort of insincere flattery, flattering the boss to try to get something done, right? You know, so the boss comes in and you say, oh, I love your hair. You really don't like the hairstyle, but you're just saying it because you want to raise or whatever. Okay, so there's that kind of insincere flattery. But what's interesting in Chinese is also essentially sincere flattery, where it's a way of showing respect. And built into the semantics of the term flattery in Chinese is showing respect, especially when the producer of the flattery is in some kind of lower social position. And what's interesting, I find, is when you look at an example of it, in Chinese, it sounds like teasing. When you look at the English translation, it sounds like sarcasm. So I'm really interested what you hear when you look at the example. So this particular example here, this is essentially a group of PhD students who are in a kind of WeChat group. So that's the same as a WhatsApp or a Line or whatever group, where they essentially chat together and swap messages amongst themselves in this group. And here we have Liu just talking about how you know, they're sort of feeling all touched by this move away from university and so on, right? And so because Liu is one of the PhD students who's graduating and moving on to other things in life. And so Hua here teases Liu, oh, stop being sentimental. So this is something more like a jocular mockery tease, right? Teasing Liu for being too sentimental. And then here Liu comes in and sort of is actually delivering an indirect apology. No, you know, so first there's a rejection of the tease. Nope, I'm not being sentimental. I also stood you up this afternoon, Hua. So this is an indirect apology from Liu for being a bit late. And this occasions a different kind of tease, this jocular flattery, which is, you were too popular. You're simply the star of our campus. Next time I need to make an appointment with you in advance. So what's happening here is Hua is responding to this jocular, indirect apology with jocular flattery. And then others join in, the star of our campus, the star is here, academic elder brother, star of our campus. So the others in the group start joining in with this jocular flattery. What's interesting here is it could, you know, I don't know how you hear it when you read this translation in English. You could interpret it as sarcasm, right? That they're being sarcastic, but this is definitely not what is going on. They do mean that Liu is really popular, and Liu is a kind of important person in the group. Of course, it's exaggerated, right? So you're the star of the whole campus. It's going too far with it, but they are sincere in actually flattering Liu here. So what's interesting, I think, about this practice is it's a form of teasing where you tease someone by exaggerating the flattery. I don't imagine it's unique to Chinese at all, but as I said, I haven't found many instances in English so far. It's interesting to think in other languages, do we see this going on? Another form of teasing, which is really interesting, is what we might call kinship-based teasing, which again is something which requires a particular cultural sort of context in which to happen. This is amongst indigenous Aboriginal Australians in Australia in what's called Arnhem Land. So here's a map of Australia, really small. Arnhem Land is right at the top. It's quite hot up there, They don't really have winter up there. It's just warm all the time. If you want to know how far away it is for me, it's actually a 5-hour flight. I'm here down in Brisbane. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to get up to Darwin, up to Arnhem Land. So it's quite a long way. There's a couple of different languages in the western part of Arnhem Land. One of them is the Binji Kunwok and also Dalabon. So these are different Aboriginal languages. There's hundreds of them, only a smaller number of them are spoken regularly. What's interesting about kinship-based teasing is it's all about indexing a relationship and a particular type of relationship. So when we're talking about affines, this is what are called relatives by marriage. So in Indigenous languages and communities in Australia, there's a lot of emphasis played on who's related to who and how they're related. And depending on how you're related to that person determines how you interact with the person. So if you're in a relationship where you're relatives by marriage, it's essentially one of the hallmarks of interaction is there's a lot of respect and avoidance talk. So an example would be when you're talking with your mother-in-law, so this is a relative by marriage, you should talk with them in a respectful and avoidance way. So there's certain topics you don't talk about, your brother-in-law, sister-in-law, and so on. What is interesting about teasing, kinship-based teasing, is this is a form of teasing where you index a relationship where you could have been relatives by marriage, but you don't expect for that to happen, either because you can't imagine it happening or because it's been explicitly renounced. So this is basically a way of showing a particular type of relationship. We could have been married, we could have been relatives by marriage, but we're not. And so this is an example here in the Binji Kunwok language, where they're talking about some bark paintings he's just completed. I won't try to read out the actual language, but just in the translation, we had the tease, you painted a heap of crap, what did you use to paint it? Shit. And then we get this response, F you, and then he continues, I'll break it and throw it in rubbish. On the surface of this, if we didn't know the context, this would sound like really harsh criticisms, right? What you painted, your bark painting is crap. You know, it looks like you just painted it with some crap. And then he just responds with an insult back. I just want to throw it away. But of course, it's understood here that this is meant as kind of a teasing, humorous, and we can see both laughing intensely in response here. So it's understood what's going on. What's really interesting about the teasing here is it's not meant to deliver criticisms or anything like that. It's actually meant to index a particular relationship that holds between the two men. So again, that's a really interesting form of teasing, a different kind of teasing practice to be looking at. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is when we think about teasing, and I put it in inverted commas because that's a word in English and it doesn't necessarily translate very straightforwardly across different languages. On one hand, it's kind of a culturally bound concept, and it's bound to particular cultural context, different societal context, different languages, but it's also a kind of socially situated practice as well. And so when we're studying teasing, we really need to be trying to address both dimensions of it. So how would we go about doing that? Okay, what I'm suggesting here is a kind of metapragmatic perspective on teasing, may provide us some insights into it. So metapragmatics, what's that about? So metapragmatics, of course, is language use about language use. And if we have language use about language use, of course, that's building on meta-language, which is language about language. So we have two forms of awareness. Obviously, they're related. Meta-linguistic awareness, that's ability to treat language itself as an object of reflection through recourse to meta-language. So we're getting really meta right now, right? So this talk is full of meta-language. But of course, when we're communicating with people, when we're trying to look at humor, we're also building on metapragmatic awareness. So this is reflex awareness on the part of users or observers of their language which is displayed through the various ways in which we use language to refer to our use of language. So we talk about things like humor and teasing and kidding, and you can actually see these things happening in interaction. So we saw an example before where the person goes, "I'm just kidding." That's a metapragmatic act in claiming that you're just kidding. Okay, so we can start to sort of distinguish between different things. There's metapragmatic labels. I know there's a lot of different terms that are used. I won't try and, which is sort of equivalent, right? But metapragmatic label is, of course, related to meta language. So these are expressions we use to refer to particular comedic concepts or phenomena: teasing, kidding, banter. You know, of course, the different terms in Chinese that I mentioned, and so on. Then we have metapragmatic acts, where you're actually using these metapragmatic labels like teasing, kidding, banter, and so on to accomplish particular social actions in interaction. And then, of course, we have the pragmatic acts themselves. So these particular social actions like teasing and so on, which we accomplish through recurrent practices. And we're accountable because we deliver it in a particular way, which makes it recognizable to those particular other participants. So I guess I've put culturally bound concept at this end of it and socially situated practice at this end. But of course, they're obviously really closely interrelated. It's more like a yin and yang or kind of dialectical thing. Things are both culturally bound and socially situated at the same time. So just to give some concrete examples of this, I'll try to go through a study on what's called taking the piss in Australian English. It's a term you see it in British English. You don't see it so much in other varieties of English. The more polite form of taking the piss is taking the mickey, is another way of saying it. If there's time, but I can see I'm running out, I'll talk a little bit about metalinguistics of teasing in Mandarin Chinese in Taiwan. So taking the piss in Australian English. Here, what's interesting is I'll just start with what I might call a meta-discourse. So in Australian society, people like talking about how humorous Australians are. What's really interesting about that is lots of societies like talking about how humorous they are. I don't know what it's like in Spain or in other European countries, but in Australia, people are obsessed with the idea that Australians are really humorous and humor is just a central part of life. So it's a very common discourse, a kind of public discourse. And you see it shared, and it comes through with this idea that Australians love taking the piss. So people describe in different ways. They bait each other's, they puncture pretensions, they knock authority, they mock pomposity, and so on. And it's cited across a lot of studies in humanities and social sciences. These are actually all historians, cultural studies people who are talking about taking the piss as kind of a really important part of Australian life. But what is taking the piss anyway? And is it really so special to Australians? Probably not, actually, but you know, national myths and all, but we all like to believe in national myths. So this was a sort of a metapragmatic approach, trying to dig into, I mean, everyone talks about taking the piss, everyone thinks they know what it is, but if you actually get someone to describe what it is, they all come up with a million different definitions. So one way in which, of course, we know we can start to understand what a word means, an expression means, is by looking at how it's used. There's not really many very big corpora of Australian English. Probably some of the largest are only a couple of million words. And in that case, you only find not many tokens of it. So I actually looked at the Oxford English corpus, which is a web-based corpus. It grabs stuff from the web, was grabbed between 2000 and 2004. And within that corpus, there's nearly 90 million tokens of Australian English, which means it's the biggest corpus of Australian English in the world. And then there's also an American and British component. So here, I was working with my colleague, our PhD student, Lara Weinglass, looking at taking the piss as a metapragmatic label. Well, how's it being used and across these different varieties? Then we wanted to look at it as a metapragmatic act. When people say, I'm just taking the piss, that was taking the piss, what are they doing when they use that phrase in interaction? So we were looking at some online discussion boards because that seemed to be consonant given the metapragmatic label is from web-based data. So one of the first things we found, not surprisingly at all, is taking the piss is very common in Australian English, in British English, but not in American English. So Americans don't use this term. I did actually have a look at when they do use it in the corpus, and when I traced it down, it was very often that they were talking about an Australian or a Brit. So it's just not a common term in American English, but it is very common in both Australian and British English, amongst British English speakers, at least as represented. When we started to look at all the different instances, we started to try to classify where the taking the piss, what was the target of the taking of the piss. In Australian English, the absolute frequencies are kind of small, so we had to be a bit careful about the percentages. Not a huge difference in self. There seemed to be a slightly higher percentage directed at self and other. And what's interesting is no specified target for taking the piss was much higher amongst the British English examples. So what we can conclude from that is when people are using the term taking the piss, it's directed at self and other more frequently amongst Australians, and it's directed, what's undirected or unspecified what the target is in British English. So that's an interesting difference across the different varieties of English. Another thing was starting to break it down in terms of, the two phrases taking the piss and take or takes the piss. And again, the specified targets. We can see again, it becomes quite clear that the Australian speakers specify the target more frequently, and the British speakers don't specify the target of taking the piss. So what's interesting here, I think, is when Australians are talking about taking the piss, they're more frequently talking about taking the piss of themselves or others, whereas British English speakers are talking about taking the piss as some kind of activity, a kind of joking activity, if you will. Okay, so what are people doing when they use it as a metapragmatic act? When you say, I'm just taking the piss. Well, there were three main sort of pragmatic functions of using this expression, at least in these online discussion boards. So one was disclaiming potential offense. Okay, so if you're teasing someone, you're trying to, mitigate the potential offense of the tease. It could actually be used for sanctioning or reproaching the person who's been doing the taking of the piss. And very often it's just used to close a sequence. So just as we use just kidding, I was just kidding, now let's move on to something serious. I was just taking the piss, closing down some kind of playful joking talk and moving back to serious business. So I'll just start with this particular example here. This is in a discussion board about toilets. Because, some people, you can get into all sorts of groups online, right? If you want to find out about things, there's the plumbing toilet group. Here, they're talking about, the person actually wants to ask about bidets. They're not very common in Australia, which is why I think they're discussing it online. Essentially, they want to ask about, a particular product. However, in the title here, you can see, instead of writing bidet, they've inadvertently put in a G, and it looks like it's bidget. And for some reason, when we hear bidget, it just sounds like a funny word. I don't know how it sounds to you, but when I hear bidget, it just makes me want to laugh. And so people started to have fun with this. So even the person said it's bidet, lol, sorry, I can't edit the title. So they couldn't fix it up. It actually started to generate this piss-taking sequence. So they essentially started teasing Frozen Flame for getting the spelling wrong. So they're probably out of stock of bidgets. I only checked in here to see what a bidget was. They might have gone down the crapper. What bidget did you order? Where did you get those bidgets from? So everyone's piling on and doing what, as we see in this next one, was, yeah, I just wanted to know what a bidget was. We should stop taking the piss. Okay, so what's interesting here is we have a metapragmatic act. One of the posters is naming what it is they're doing, and they're naming it as taking the piss. But in doing that, what they're actually doing is essentially signaling maybe it's time to stop, right? We should stop this. The discussion board is not about you know, teasing and joking. We're here to do serious business, which is to talk about toilets and plumbing and bidets. And so we should stop taking the piss. And immediately after that, actually the teasing stops and they go back to serious talk, is what happens here. And again, this particular example, I don't have time to go through all of it. So it's in, you know, in the forthcoming paper or talk about it, but essentially they're talking about home brew. This is people who like to make their own beer. Again, that was very popular for a while. There's a few hard hangers on who keep on trying to home brew their own beer. So they have to gather online to talk about it because most people don't do this anymore, right? It was, I don't know, popular a while back. Anyway, this one here, this person's talking about, you know, they say, you know, I'm relatively new to this wonderful world of brewing, but I'm feeling let out. I haven't felt the need to panic about my brews fermenting. I'm still unstressed. So basically, it seems like they're teasing the other people on the board about how seriously they take all this home brew stuff. They're all talking about it really seriously. And then it comes in with the, I'm just taking the piss. So here, it seems to be kind of inoculating against offense or disclaiming offense. Okay, so I'm teasing you about how serious you are about home brew, but I didn't really mean it. I'm just taking the piss. I'm just kidding, or I'm just joking. But what was interesting here is this person then asked, what does just taking the piss mean? This is a really interesting post because surely the person can't be serious in asking, what does taking the piss mean? And what seems to be happening here is by asking, what does taking the piss mean? The person does seem to be taking the piss. And so this person then comes in with a kind of definition of it and then says, I'm just taking the piss as well, and so on. So this is a really interesting example of things getting really meta with this kind of joking routine as well. So I'm not sure if we got much closer in understanding what taking the piss is here, but it's certainly, you can see why people see this as quite a kind of important cultural practice amongst Australian speakers of English. People do talk about it, and it's something that they can talk about, as we see here. Okay.
I'm sorry, Michael. 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll be brief with this one here because I really just wanted to, of course, talking about Chinese data is probably not going to be that accessible for everyone here. I don't know if anyone speaks Chinese amongst the group, but anyway, I just wanted to get at something which I think is actually relevant to people working on humour studies, actually in any language, which is, what is the particular language you're using to describe what it is you're doing, right? And so there's sort of different ways we can get at this meta language when we talk about the kind of humour related meta language, different metapragmatic labels we use for humour in different languages. There's sort of the corpus-based methods where you're essentially aggregating all the instances of the occurrence of these particular metapragmatic labels, and you're trying to get an aggregated sense across a population of what that term is used to mean. But of course, another way of getting at these metapragmatic labels is you actually dig into what it means for particular people at particular points in time. And something like, if you actually dig into a term like taking the piss, even though if you aggregate all the instances of it and try to come out as some kind of joking, puncturing pretensions type of practice, if you actually ask individuals, people have different attitudes about it. So some people will say taking the piss, that's awesome, we love it, this is Australian culture. Others will say, I hate it. It's an awful thing. It's a thing that people use to bully people and pretend that it's just friendly, but actually they're just bullying people. So what I'm getting at here is people have different understandings of these kind of terms. We don't understand everything in exactly the same way. And in particular, we often have different affective responses depending on our experience of these things, right? So it's interesting to look at these things from a kind of corpus aggregated perspective, but also from a more individuated, interview-based approach. I won't go through this. The only point I would make is there's quite a few different terms for teasing in Chinese. In fact, we just looked at 6. And so we were interested in how they relate to each other. And essentially, they're kind of, you can arrange them on a continuum from hostile, harsh teasing to kind of really friendly stuff. Is essentially what's going on. And then what we were really interested in is, would people use the same labels to describe the same thing? So we showed a bunch of people, a group of people, 2 different teasing events, and we asked them what they thought of it. And then we basically noted down the different teasing terms they used. Here, these 2 are teasing each other about shopping. You know, I think you're a shopaholic, you're the same, you should go and see a doctor. I can help introduce you to a psychiatric hospital. So even though it seems like it's a bit harsh, this is pretty friendly teasing between 2 friends. What's interesting here, perhaps not surprisingly, we see people were labeling these things at the kind of more affectionate or bonding end of teasing terms in Chinese, but also notice this variation. It's not that people or our participants label the same event in exactly the same way. And this is another case. I won't go through the details because I know I'm running out of time. But what we found is with a more harsh teasing event, yes, the respondents were labeling it with the more harsh related teasing term, which is chao xiao in Chinese, but they used other terms. And they even used, one of them even regarded it as kai wan xiao, which is just really gentle type of friendly teasing. So I guess the point we were trying to make is people have agency when they're labeling things, and they label things in different ways. So there was a couple of things we found in that study, which is teasing seems to be conceptualized differently by speakers of Mandarin Chinese, at least in the sample that we're looking at. And what was interesting, when they were talking about teasing, rather than talking about the intentions of speakers, they really seemed to talk a lot about how they thought the person was going to respond. Would they be happy or sad? Would they think it's friendly, or would they be hurt by it? Whereas when we've talked with English speakers about teasing, they talk a lot about, oh, I didn't mean it. I was just kidding. It's not real. It's not genuine. So the focus when they talk about teasing is all about the speaker's intentions. When Chinese speakers are talking about it, Mandarin Chinese speakers, they're talking a lot about the effective responses to the teasing. And they don't talk much about what the speaker may or may not be meaning, which is really interesting, I think. The second thing we found is when people are using these metapragmatic labels, they tend to use different ones. But what's interesting, when you use the harsh term for teasing, like chao xiao, versus a friendly term for teasing like kai wan xiao, you're construing that tease really, really differently. And so, of course, that's really interesting to think about when we're looking at this teasing as well in different languages. Okay. So I started with the idea when we're looking at teasing, at least this jocular end, it's a heterogeneous group of actions. There's a whole different bunch of practices. I talked about some of them, which I've tried to characterize in work: jocular mockery, jocular pretence, jocular baiting. And the way that I'm distinguishing between these is the teasers are designed to sort of elicit different responses from speakers, whether it's laughter, serious responses, counter teasers, and so on. But I also talked about other kinds of teasing. So there's jocular flattery in the Mandarin Chinese interactions in these WhatsApp type of WeChat interactions, and also the kinship-based teasing, which seem to be very different teasing practices. Then I went to talk about metapragmatics and saying, well, these different labels that we can use construe teasing events in different ways, and they relate to the sort of underlying conceptualization of teasing that we can find across different languages and cultures. And I guess the general point I was trying to make is that the sort of corpus-based metapragmatic approach offers insights that complement sort of sequential or interactional analyses, I hope, and help us to sort of navigate that tension between looking at teasing as a culturally bound concept and teasing as a socially situated practice. Okay, and that's just a few of the references there. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your brilliant talk. It was very, very interesting for us, for our creative research project and our research on humor. It's time to questions and suggestions, etc. Maybe you can write your questions on the chat, or you can open your microphones for questions. Paco?
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael, for this insightful presentation. I was, while listening to you, I was wondering, taking into account the amount of elements that are, that are into this phenomenon of teasing, how many things are working at the same time, like the kind of relationship being held between the interlocutors, intra or intercultural things, the situation, and how close teasing is normally to being rude or being get people getting angry. I was just wondering. I think that successful teasing is actually surprising, don't you think? In terms of how many elements can go wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. What's interesting, I like studies in social psychology about teasing, and one of the things they've found is speakers consistently and systematically overestimate how good they are at teasing. And so very often what you're trying to get at is teasing goes wrong, but speakers more often think it's going well, and of course the targets tend to think it's not going so well. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. What is a successful tease? Okay, maybe the person's laughing in the moment, but actually they feel quite
the thing is you also
teasing, right?
You showed people who were not close friends, no? And despite that, they still engage in teasing, and that's super dangerous, I think.
Yeah, so what I found, this was working with Danielle, we did a study looking at it, and what we thought was going on was teasing was a way, because when you don't know people, teasing away is sort of inviting intimacy, which is, you don't know each other, you successfully tease the person. Wow, you've managed to get, I have examples where it goes really badly wrong, actually, and they get quite upset with each other, which is interesting to look at too.
There are two questions on the chat. Carmen Maíz says, he was wondering whether there are any cultures that do not favor teasing at all.
I think we'd have to ask an anthropologist, maybe, to enlighten us on that. I don't know. That would be fascinating. I don't know. It's hard to imagine with human nature, but I don't know. I think it's probably more a matter of where and when and who can do the teasing and where it's acceptable. It's true to say in Australian culture, there's quite a breadth of places you can do it. I mean, an example, this is not teasing, but, when you're at funerals in Australia, people joke, which is unimaginable in, say, Taiwan or China. You would never joke at a funeral. You just can't joke at a funeral. But in Australia, yes, you can. So it's sort of, not too much, right? But people do joke, difficult time, and so they do this to relieve tension. So I guess it's more a matter of when and where and who, and can you tease them? Maybe that varies across cultures as well. But yeah, it's a great question. I'd love to know the answer.
Yeah, that's another question.
Carmen says is the same here in Spain.
Yeah. Oh, okay. You can do the same thing at funerals to ease the tension.
The best place to tell jokes.
Yes.
In Israel too.
Okay. Yeah,
we tease all the time.
Yeah. So the kinship-based teasing is similar to joking relationships. Yeah, I think there is a connection there. Yes, and in the study by Gard, he was making a connection to that. Absolutely.
There's another question, Michael, from Anastasia Fiatova. She says, do you think that kinship-based teasing in Australia is similar to joking relationships that Radcliffe Brown described in Africa?
Yeah. So I guess I'm not the expert on kinship-based teasing, so I'm relying on that study and other studies. But in the work that's been done by the linguistic anthropologists on teasing, yes, they very much relate it to those joking relationships. And in the study, he talks more about joking relationships than he does about teasing. But it's really obvious that's what's going on in the interactions there, that they're teasing and, jocular insults and jocular teases with each other. But what's interesting is that it's embedded in kind of relationships, which, it's a function of the way in which that society and community is working. But yeah, to my mind, kinship-based teasing is just, it's really interesting to look at. It's not something that happens in my family. So it's clearly a culturally bound type of approach to teasing, right? So really, really fascinating. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's really interesting to start looking across different languages and cultures and seeing, the overlapping similarities, but also the differences and so on that's going on. But once we start doing that, then we need meta language to talk about it. And that is just super challenging, I think.
There is another sorry.
I'm just reading a comment, the British are more witty, right? I'm sorry, I don't know if that's being serious or not.
I think
maybe
sarcastic, maybe than Italian people. Oh.
Yeah. So sorry. I don't know if you had other questions that you wanted to ask. I know we're running out of time, and it's Leonore's time to talk very soon.
I think there is very interesting these metapragmatic levels for the speakers, for the listener and speaker, to understand humor, to understand the teasing.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Sounds fascinating. So, I guess I'd just be advocating researchers to do more of this work around the metapragmatics of humor and so on. Teasing is just one example, but I think it would really enrich our field of pragmatics to do this kind of work, more of it. It's challenging, but I think really...
It's challenging. We need more works on metapragmatics of teasing and humor. Thank you.